Hello, hopefully everybody can hear me, that I'm not too loud or too quiet, and welcome to Spooky History. So tonight we're doing a live streamed episode for several reasons. First of all, I really like doing live episodes. I quite enjoy them myself, and hopefully you folks do as well. And also today is the anniversary of the birth of Modern Spiritualism. So as we usually put episodes out on a Thursday, I thought it'd be useful to use today to discuss this, the death blow to spiritualism. The true story of Katie and Maggie Fox, the founders of Modern Spiritualism. Just a few things before we actually jump into it. If you're watching on the YouTube feed or the Facebook feed or the Twitch feed, hello to the one person on Twitch, which might actually be me, just leave a question if you have one down in the comments, and my assistant Teresa will give me them at the end of this, and hopefully I can answer as many of them as possible. This will last a little longer than a normal episode of Spooky History, which usually lasts about 10 minutes. This will last about an hour. I'm aware that there are events going on in various parts around the world to discuss spiritualism and Kate and Maggie Fox, and I thought I would throw my hat into the ring as well and do my own talk. I've been wanting to do a talk on the Fox sisters since Spooky History began. For those of you who don't know what Spooky History is, it's a regular YouTube series where I talk about the weird, the strange, the paranormal, things that go bump in the night, and I don't just mean your horny next door neighbours. So it's all sorts of things, and it's not done from any particular stance. We just look at what the story is and we tell it to people, and if there's evidence that might debunk it, we don't shy away from saying that, just so it, we want to be as open and honest as possible. And that's what's going to happen tonight. I'm not here tonight to say this is all nonsense. I'm not here tonight to say this all absolutely happened. I'm here to say this is what history records. You make up your own mind. You take away from this what you want to take away from this. During my roundup at the end, I will talk a little bit more about what the Fox sisters mean to me, because who am I? I am a performer. I'm a magician. I'm specifically a mentalist, and mentalism has a lot to thank Kate and Maggie Fox for. About 100 years ago, when mentalism first really starts to enter the mainstream, a lot of the early mentalists, mind readers, borrowed quite heavily from spiritualism. So a lot of what I do, especially what I do, which is much more spooky themed, really draws on the Fox sisters. With all that being said, I think that's the introduction just about covered. Follow us on most social media at Spooky Hist Show. You can follow me personally at It's Ash Pryce. And hopefully you find out some stuff about the Fox sisters you didn't know. And if you not know anything about them at all, then this is all going to be new information for you. So buckle up and sit back, relax. Have a cup of tea or coffee. I'm having a cup of coffee from my Maggie and Kate Fox mug, which I picked up when I was over in Hydesville a couple of years ago. I have a Fox Sisters mug. Weird as that. So, let us begin our tale right back at the beginning, before Kate and Maggie Fox actually come onto the scene. Because I'm sure you're kind of sitting there thinking, well, he's mentioned things like Hydesville and the Fox Sisters and various other things, and I don't know anything about any of those things, so what on earth is he talking about? Hold off just a few moments, because we need to lay the groundwork of setting the scene in a proper theatrical sense. Throughout history, there have been all sorts of stories and tales of ghosts and ghouls. Maggie and Kate Fox, who are the founders of Modern Spiritualism, were not the first people to claim to talk to the dead or communicate with the dead. There are various reasons why they became the most prominent, but throughout time there have been lots and lots of stories about spooks, spectres, ghosts and ghouls. And it looks like my camera has frozen ever so slightly. Hopefully that's not going to continue on for too long. But hey, my voice is more important than my pretty face. So, you can see here in this image there are three pictures. Top left, we have got a picture that represents the appearance of the spirit Samuel to the Witch of Endor in the Bible. This is one of the earliest examples of spirits coming through. And the Bible doesn't have very many mentions of what we would call ghosts, but this is one of the better known examples, one of the better examples of it. In the middle, we have got, this is a drawing. This is from the 1760s. And this is to do with a haunting that took place in London, in England. And I'll get to that in just a moment, because there's quite a bit of backstory to this one. It's a bit strange. But just briefly mention the bottom right picture. That is, of course, Banquo, the ghost in Macbeth. Ghosts appear quite a lot in Shakespeare's work. So kind of back to that centre picture there. This is to do with the haunting of a place down in London. I'm going to get banned from most of my social media accounts for saying this, but it is the ghost of Cock Lane. Specifically speaking, her name was Scratching Fanny, the ghost of Cock Lane. I know it sounds rude, it sounds a bit weird, but it was the 18th century. They were a little bit weird back then. So this story is one of the most famous seances in British history that you probably may not have heard of. And I do want to do a spooky history episode on this as well at some point. But essentially a chap called William Kent and his wife Fanny, the eponymous Scratching Fanny of the story, they moved into some lodgings in London, a place called Cock Lane, and they lived with a gentleman called Richard Parsons. Now, Richard Parsons ended up borrowing money from William Kent, and he didn't pay it back. So William Kent took him to court, and there's a whole court case about this. Fanny died a few months later, and Richard Parsons, still angry about William Kent having taken him to court, decides that he's going to conjure up the spirit of his late wife Fanny, and wouldn't you know, she just happens to say that her husband murdered her. And there's a huge scandal, and the Mayor of London comes to witness these seances, and Samuel Johnson, the creator of the dictionary, he comes to witness these seances, and it's huge. There are little skits that are performed at theatre shows around London. There's all sorts. It's huge, phenomenal, one of the most well-known, one of the biggest seances in British history. Anyway, it's all a scam. It's all a scam perpetrated by Richard Parsons in order to get back at William Kent, who sued him for money that he owed. So that's Scratching Fanny, the ghost of Cock Lane. The reason this ghost was called Scratching Fanny was because the woman was called Fanny, and the noises the ghost would make was scratch, scratch, scratch. So, yeah, Scratching Fanny, the ghost of Cock Lane. We will do a full episode on that at some point, because it's just wild. Getting a little bit closer to the Fox sisters now, I want to introduce you to these two gentlemen. This on the left is Emanuel Swedenborg, and next to him is Franz Anton Mesmer. I'm going to cover Mesmer first, because his link to spiritualism is, well, anyone who knows anything about mesmerism will go, what? So Franz Mesmer gave us mesmerism. Mesmerism is where we kind of get a lot of the ideas of hypnotism. There are differences, but ultimately that's where it comes from. You may have heard of animal magnetism. That is Mesmer's biggest contribution to allegedly science. Essentially, there's this idea that there is this vital fluid that flows through the body, and it is magnetized, and people can manipulate this magnetized vital fluid in order to cure and heal individuals by moving it around the body. Usually what happens is the person who's being magnetized, mesmerized, is in a trance-like state, and this gets kind of mixed up with various different ideas of connecting in with your own subconscious, didn't call it subconscious back then, and later on is retroactively fit into the idea of spiritualism. A chap called Putnam writes a book, and he references mesmerism being connected to spiritualism and the mesmeric trance as being a way in which spirit can come through, because spirits are also magnetized and they connect with the spirits, with the medium, sorry. And so that's where that idea kind of came from. This Putnam chap also put forward the idea he believed that the witches of Salem were actually spiritualists, that they just didn't know it. And so that's stuff that Putnam has put forward. That's Anton Mesmer. Next we have Emanuel Swedenborg. Swedenborg, my phone has stopped connecting, my camera stopped connecting again, so hopefully we'll try and get that back on. Swedenborg was a natural historian. He worked within natural history, and he wrote and published books on natural history. And that was kind of where he was mainly focused until he started having revelations, the Lord coming to him in his dreams. And he developed this idea, which sounds a lot like purgatory, that there is a middle world, the world of spirit, between the living world and heaven and hell. You essentially go from this world into the world of spirit, and that is where your spirit becomes pure and honest and truthful, and the decision is made on whether to send you upstairs or downstairs. So if you take Swedenborg's ideas, and if you take mesmerism, and you get them like plasticine and smoosh them together, you kind of have what would become spiritualism. So I hope that all makes sense. That's just to really lay the groundwork, because I think it's really important to have that groundwork there. But let's actually get on to the main topic, which is a map of New York. Okay, there's actually context to it. The red areas, this is a Google map. This is called the Burned Over District, and it's a part of Western New York. We can see the large lake just at the top there is Lake Ontario, and around the middle of the picture there are the Finger Lakes. And the Burned Over District is an area where in the 19th century all sorts of religions took place and kickstarted or began or had a really dominant denomination focused there. It was a central area. Before the Fox sisters come along in 1848, about 18 years earlier, you've got Joseph Smith, the gentleman who founded the Church of Latter-day Saints. He found the tablets left by God just outside of a place called Palmyra, which is about a 20-minute drive from Hydesville. So Hydesville is about an hour from Rochester, which is the main city, or the biggest main city in this area. You can just see on that map there, it's much closer to the Finger Lakes. And if we take another map, we've got a little red dot marking the Fox sisters' house, which was in Hydesville, and to the left of the picture you can see Rochester as well. And we can see that the Fox sisters' house is round about Newark area. Now, they used to live in a place called Hydesville. That is where the Fox sisters' home was. Hydesville no longer exists. It got eaten up by Arcadia, and is now pretty much just fields, really. That's all that's left of it. But the area is still quite populous. There's still a lot of people around the area, and especially in Rochester as well. So in 1847, December 1847, John and his wife, Margaret Fox, they moved into a house in Hydesville. Now, this was only a temporary thing. John and Margaret were only going to be staying there a short period of time whilst their main house was being built. Nearby, there was their son, David. It's the only son they had. And they had four other daughters. There was Anne Lee Fox, who was the oldest sister, pushing 30. There was the youngest sister, Katie, who was 11. The next youngest sister, Margaretta Maggie, she was 14 or 15. The exact age is debated. And then there is a additional sister who, I believe it was Elizabeth or Maria. One of them survived into adulthood, the other one did not. Either way, neither of them are particularly relevant to the story. So we will focus on the ones that are. And that is Maggie and Kate. So their parents, John and Margaret, they moved in with Maggie and Kate to this house in December 1847 in order to wait for their main house to be built. Now, John and Margaret's relationship had been a bit up and down over the years. John had turned to alcohol, something that will come back to haunt his daughters. But stick with us, that's for spoilers. And he gave all of that up because he adopted a very devout Christian faith, and he became a pure gentleman. He would attend church frequently and regularly. He was a very upstanding member of society, and his wife, who had left him due to his alcohol abuse, came back to him. So the family, John, Margaretta, and their two youngest daughters, have set up home here. We can see the Fox house there. That is, I believe, actually a later picture after the house was moved. I'll explain that in the wrap-up at the end. And you can see a picture from the inside of the house as well. It's quite a small house, quite a bare house, nothing particularly impressive. It only had one main bedroom upstairs, and the parents slept downstairs. So this was just a temporary accommodation. And when they moved in, they start hearing strange noises. Strange noises. It's mainly Maggie and Kate who hear these strange noises first. And they're not sure what they are. Mrs. Fox is deeply fascinated and a little bit scared. Mr. Fox don't really care. Just ignoring them. Nothing to do with him. He's going to get on with his pipe and his newspaper. So the knocks start to come to a head in March of 1848. And the knocks get louder and louder and bigger and more invasive. And on Friday the 31st of March, 1848, 174 years ago tonight, it really reaches a crescendo. Now, on that night, Anne Lee, the older sister, her daughter, Lizzie, is staying with Maggie and Katie. And she can attest to the fact that she too heard these knocks. Boom, 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 knock, 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 rat-a-tat-tat in the room. And they're scared. And they call up Mrs. Fox to come and listen to them. And it's a little unclear whether it's Maggie or Kate who does this next thing. But one of them does. They say, "Do as I do." And this is really pivotal. This is what really helps to kind of kickstart spiritualism. The do as I do. Because it creates a communication. Maggie or Kate, one of the two, like I say, it's not entirely clear which one it is. The mother, Mrs. Fox, in different accounts, does actually say each of them. But one of them says, "Do as I do." And they knock several times. And these supernatural knocks come back that many times. And they start asking it questions. Mrs. Fox asks, "How many children do I have? How many children do I have living? How old are each of my children?" And knock, 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 knock. They keep coming back. And this startles them and unsettles them. And they go for a neighbour. They get a neighbour to come along. And they say, "Can you hear this? Ask it questions." And the neighbour does ask questions. Knock, 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 rat-a-tat-tat. And then more neighbours come, and more neighbours. And on this quiet Friday evening in the middle of Western New York, you've got knock, knock, knocks, and people. And they ask some really important questions. They develop a communication method. We're using a different variety of knocks. So 2 knocks becomes maybe or don't know. 1 for no, 3 for yes. Slightly different to how we might imagine it. 5 knocks is fetch the alphabet board, which was not a Ouija board, but was a board with letters on, which you could use to spell out longer words. And through all of this, they discover what and who they are talking to. They're talking to Mr. Charles B. Rosner, or Rosmer, sometimes called Mr. Splitfoot. And he was a peddler. He used to sell trinkets in the area. He'd go from house to house about 5 years ago. And about 5 years ago, the inhabitant of the house, Mr. John Bell, murdered Charles B. Rosner, according to this spirit, over the sum of $500 that Rosner had on him. And Bell took Rosner's body down into the basement and buried it. And it was kept there. And that's what had happened. And all of the people who were gathered, they were going wild. And they went downstairs into the cellar. And they take their shovels and their axes and they start digging up and digging up and digging up. And water. They hit mud and dirt and nothing. Don't hit anything. But that doesn't stop them. People are still fascinated. And the story starts to spread. And as the story starts to spread, more and more people come out of the woodwork and say, actually, when I lived in that house, I also experienced things. And all of these stories were put together in a pamphlet which was called A Report of the Mysterious Noises Heard in the House of Mr. John D. Fox in Hydesville, Arcadia, Wayne County, authenticated by the certificates and confirmed by the statements of the citizens of that place and vicinity. Some light bedtime reading. It is actually very, very light. And all the accounts of what happened that night are contained in this little pamphlet. And I want to read one of them to you that kind of backs up the ghostly goings on, because like I say, the Fox sisters weren't the first to experience this. This is a statement by Mrs. Jane C. Lape. She used to work in the house several years before the Foxes came along. She was 19, and she says, one day, about 2:00 p.m, while I was doing my work in the kitchen, I saw a man in the bedroom joining the kitchen. The bedroom door was open, and I saw the man distinctly. I was much frightened. The man stood facing me when I saw him. He did not speak, nor did I hear any noise at any time, like a person walking or moving about in the room. He had on grey pants, black frock coat, and black cap. He was about middling size. Mrs. Weekman, the woman she worked for, was in another part of the house at this time, and I was very much frightened and left the room. And when I returned with Mrs. W, there was no person there. Stories like this were common once the knocks became known. People reported hearing knocks. People reported seeing the peddler, the spirit of him. But still, no body was found. Around 14 men of the neighbourhood wrote a letter saying, we do not believe John Smith committed this crime. But the story was out there, and the haunting tale had begun. Now, it took a while before Anne Lee, she was living in Rochester, the oldest sister. I will interchange between Anne Lee, and just Lee. She went with all of them. She lived in Rochester with her children, one of whom, Lizzie, we've already mentioned. And she had been married to a Mr. Fish. And Mr. Fish had up and left. Kind of upsetting and embarrassing for her. So Anne Lee Fox Fish was her name at this stage. And she hears about what happened in Hydesville, and she quickly heads down there to join her family, to find out what was going on, to find out what was happening. And she gets there, and the people of the neighbourhood are all descending on the Fox household to find out more tales from Mr. Splitfoot, from Mr. Rosner, from the ghost. And Lee, she comes in, and she talks with Maggie and Kate and her family. And she decides she's going to stay around for a little while. She's really curious about what's happening. And she recounts a tale that had happened, that over the days leading up to it, there had been a lot of backlash against the family, lots of threats against the family, so much so that they had got bags of gunpowder and bags of metal shot in order to defend themselves against any mobs that descended. And whilst Lee is there, news reaches the house that indeed one of those mobs is on its way. Horses and wagons making its way to Hydesville, to the Fox house, to I don't know what. Just there to intimidate them because they're talking to the dead. And they arrive, and older brother David steps outside to address the mob. He doesn't want to shoot them. He doesn't want to fire on them. But the spirits tell Maggie and Kate that all will be safe. And the spirits throw the bag of gunpowder at Katie's face. David goes outside to talk to the mob. And the mob stare at David and go, "Oh, it's you, David! Didn't know it was you, thought it was someone else. Oh well, we'll just be on our way." Obviously in 19th century American vernacular. And they disappear. Weird. So this type of thing happens quite a lot, actually. Not just to the Fox sisters, but to other spiritualists around the time. Whether you believe in spiritualism or not, I think there's something particularly distasteful about a mob of armed men descending on the home of children, regardless of what you think about spiritualism. I'm not entirely sure that is a good, acceptable thing. So these are the sisters. On the left, we have Maggie. In the middle, we have Katie. And on the right, we have Lee, or Anne Lee. The left one is an actual photo. The one on the right is a drawing or an etching that's taken from the actual photograph. And the Fox sisters decide to stick together. After this incident that's happened at Hydesville, and after the worry that's been caused to Mrs. Fox because of the ghosts, Anne Lee says, I will take my sisters in. I will take them with me to Rochester where I live, and hopefully the ghosts, the spirits, will not follow us there. And so they head to Rochester, and the spirits follow them there. Not only do the spirits follow them there, but Lee discovers she too can talk to the dead as well. And these knocks come through when Lee is acting as medium as well. Accompanying the three women is a gentleman by the name of Calvin Brown. He was a confectioner. He was essentially an adoptive child of the Fox family. His parents died very, very close to Anne Lee. And he joins them to sort of look after them all, to make sure they're all okay. So they've headed down to Rochester. Big city, big city. And they continue to do these little gatherings of people who come to the house and want to communicate with the spirits. It's not Charles B. Rosner anymore. It's just spirits generally. Now they're communicating with any and all spirits. Knock, 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 rat-a-tat-tat. Some people come to the house to ask for work advice. What should I do? One gentleman came along. The Fox spirits gave him contradictory advice to what he was expecting to do. Confused, he went off and did it, and then ended up with a big job in the city that he made a lot of money from, bought a house. Lots of people start to gravitate towards the Fox sisters, including family friends, Isaac and Amy Post. Isaac and Amy Post, they're on the right, the middle person and the right-hand side. That's Amy and Isaac Post. They were very, very prominent abolitionists in the 19th century, and they were good friends with the Fox sisters, and they helped to support them. They are among the earliest converts we have to spiritualism. And whilst they're staying in Rochester, more spirits start to come through, including a spirit that communicates with Lee all the time. Benjamin Franklin comes through to communicate with Lee all the time, like they're best mates. And these spirits, they start telling the Fox sisters, look, it's been a few months now. We need you to make more of a scene of this. We need to make more of a noise of spiritualism. We need you to bring it to the public masses. And I've just noticed how my camera is frozen. Beautiful look there, yeah. And so the spirits say you need to go and do a big scene. You need to make a public display of spiritualism. You need to make sure that people know who we are. And they say, okay, well, where are we going to do it? What are we going to do it for? And the spirits say, oh, Corinthian Hall. What's Corinthian Hall, you may be wondering? Well, Corinthian Hall was this place. It was in Rochester. It was a huge building for the time, and certainly a huge building for people like the Fox sisters to be performing in. And so they hired out Corinthian Hall to give a live demonstration of spiritualism to the masses so that they could be alerted to the wonder of spirit communication. And it's not all of them that goes along. It's Maggie and Lee, and they go along, and they're introduced, and they take to the stage, and you hear the knocks reverberating around this building, Corinthian Hall, huge place, November the 14th, 1848. And it causes an outrage. It causes an absolute outrage. The people gathered in the Corinthian Hall lose their minds. They start storming the stage. They start shooting off guns. They start absolutely threatening these children. And they say, we need proof. We need evidence. And what we're going to do is put together a team of 5 renowned and respected men of town to test you, to prove that you are a fraud. Okay, they agree to that, and they go away. And these men, they gather the Fox sisters, and it's quite invasive, actually, for standards of the time. It's quite rude. Gripping and grabbing and pulling at the girls, holding their legs and feet and ankles in order to test. They think the noises are being caused by their kneecaps or something like that. That's the dominant theory, the kneecap theory. They even get them to stand on pillows and tightly hold their dresses around their legs. Next day, they gather again at Corinthian Hall. These 5 learned men, they get to the stage and say, yeah, can't find any evidence of fraud. Crowd goes wild again. Demands another inquiry. Another 5 men are selected. Again, the Fox sisters go away. Tested again. Invasive. Rude. Come back that night. Yeah, can't find any evidence of fraud. Crowd go even more wild. Firecrackers thrown at the stage. Threats on their life. There's even stories that some of the people turned up with nooses. That is how extreme this was. Another 5 people must test them. So again, they go off. 5 more people test them. Come back the next day. The police are there now. The entire front row is just the local police. And it's a little quieter because there are now more supporters of the Fox sisters in attendance. And again, these 5 gentlemen take to the stage and go, can't find any evidence of fraud. And this is it. This is when everything changes for the Fox sisters. Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, gentleman on the left here, he becomes a strong supporter of spiritualism. And he invites them to New York, where interest in spiritualism is gaining attention. It's getting bigger and bigger, and more people are interested in spiritualism. And the Fox sisters, they take them up on the offer, and they go, yeah, we'll go to New York. So they're put up by Horace Greeley in lovely, expensive housing, accommodation, and they get to attend these growing spiritualist circles. And suddenly they discover they're not alone. Other mediums appear who can also communicate with the dead. Spirits can come through. And it's not just Knox either. Anne Lee, some of her seances, she brings through spirit lights, spirit orbs, making their way into the darkened rooms. And the Fox sisters don't stay in New York. They continue to tour around the whole of the state into various other parts of the country. They become celebrities, but they still face trouble. There are more cases of angry mobs chasing them and attacking them and trying to shoot them. This happens a lot. So the Fox sisters are now becoming a bit established. They're a little set up in New York. People are paying attention to them. They are getting constant barrage of requests to be tested, and they go along with them. They accept the tests, and constantly the people doing the tests aren't able to find definitive proof of fraud. The dominant theory was kneecap cracking, and there was one group of researchers from Buffalo, I believe it was, and they found someone who could do this with their kneecap, cause it to crack on demand. And they said, we've proven it. We've disproven the Fox sisters. We've proven their frauds because we've got this other person who can create the cracks with their kneecaps. They put this woman to a further test and find she can only do it for a short period of time before it's painful and she's unable to do it. Whereas the Fox sisters, the knocks that emanate from them is done all day. And the other thing about the Fox sisters is the noises don't always come directly from them, but from around the room, in different parts of the room, all over the place. And yet they are constantly barraged with demands for tests, with people wanting to know more, with people attending their seances and wanting to expose them. But they become superstars, absolute megastars. In her book, The Missing Link of Modern Spiritualism, Lee talks about what they used to charge for some of those seances. If you were going to a group seance, it was $1 a head. If you were going to a private seance, it was $5. And they could make $100, $150 a week, which, okay, $150. What's the exchange rate? Today, several $1,000s a week. That's what they were making from these seances, thousands of dollars a week. A lot of money for anyone, let alone 3 women from a farming background. And Maggie and Kate are young and they're attractive, and society is interested in young, attractive people who can do amazing things. And they become the toast of the town. And Lee continues to act as a sort of manager for the two younger sisters. So she does her own seances as well, but she continues to act as a sort of manager for them. Now, around about this time, Calvin and Lee, their relationship has become very, very close. And in 1851, just a few years into all of this, Calvin is very sick on his deathbed, and he wants to make an honest woman of Lee because she's got a lot of stigma attached to what happened with Mr. Fish. And so he says, I will marry you so that when I die, you are a proper widow and you will be respectable. So she marries him, and then he lives for another 2 years. But they were close, so I'm sure it was great. So she becomes Anne Lee Fox Fish Brown at this stage. Doesn't get rid of any of her names, keeps them all. She's hoarding them like gold. And so she marries Calvin as Maggie and Kate are becoming celebrities, megastars. And people from all walks of life are coming to see their seances, including this gentleman. In 1852, this gentleman, Elisha Kent Kane, comes to one of the seances that's being held in New York. Now, Elisha is an explorer, an Arctic explorer. He travels around the Arctic areas exploring, because that's what I literally just said. And some of the things he does, he kind of looks for missing expeditions as well. That's probably what he's best known for. And he's from a very, very wealthy family. Very wealthy. A family that is completely different level to the Fox sisters. Now, Elisha is a bit of a skeptic. He doesn't believe that the Fox sisters are actually talking to the dead, and he thinks it's nonsense. But one thing he doesn't think is nonsense is Maggie Fox. And Maggie and Elisha form a close friendship. And Elisha spends a lot of time coming back to these seances, becoming very close with Maggie. And he starts trying to convince her to leave spiritualism behind. And a romance springs up between the two of them. Now, his family do not encourage this romance at all. They do not want anything to do with it, and they do not want their son to have anything to do with a rapper, a spirit rapper, a table rapper. Nothing to do with her. And so they kind of carry on their relationship in secret. It's an open secret. Maggie's family knows. The mother's a little bit uncomfortable about it. There is quite an age difference between the two of them. And Elisha is away for great periods of time, sometimes years at a time. And they continue to become very, very close. And they have a lot of letters back and forth written to each other. And it's kind of an up and down relationship. There's a lot of arguing, a lot of debating, a lot of kind of joking mockery between the two of them. And they become close. It's not entirely clear how close they became, if you get my drift, but they did spend a lot of time together. Now, Elisha was going off in 1857. He'd just come back from a very, very long expedition to find a missing explorer. He was going over to England to talk to the explorer's wife to kind of say, not really had much luck. So before he left, he and Maggie decided to get married, so that she could be made a proper woman of. He had already given her a lot of money before for giving her an education. On several occasions during their several years together, he'd got her to move slowly away from spiritualism and put her in school to get an education. And so he says, I'm going to do one last thing before I head off to England, and that is I'm going to marry you. So they're back in New York, and it's not in front of a priest or anyone like that. It's in front of Katie, Anne Lee, and the mother, Margaret Fox. And at this stage, marriage vows didn't require necessarily a religious figure to have the marriage accepted as a real marriage. It just needed to have witnesses. And so that's what they did. And Elisha goes off to England and becomes very, very sick and is sent to the tropics where he dies. And he leaves Maggie a widow. And this is where a lot of the problems for Maggie begin. She and Katie had started drinking to deal with a lot of the attention they were getting. And her drinking after Elisha's death became extreme. We already know that her father struggled with alcohol. Now Maggie and Kate as well are doing so. Big fans of champagne. But Maggie takes Elisha's death very, very hard. And what she takes even harder is the fact that Cain's family refuses to acknowledge her and refuses to pay her what she was left by Elisha. And this fight between her and the family go on for many, many years. She manages to get into a situation where Elisha's brother agrees to pay her a regular allowance. And there are several times this allowance is missed. And she has to fight for it and chase it. And eventually she says, if you don't pay me what's owed to me, I'm going to publish the love letters between me and Elisha. By the time she actually does do this, attention and interest in Elisha Kent Cain has disappeared, and it doesn't really have the impact that she was hoping. So she kind of continues drinking a lot, and we don't really know much more about what was happening to Maggie in this period, from the mid-1850s to about the 1880s. Her life kind of is a blank. She was doing something. She was doing fewer seances. She had converted to Catholicism. She was probably being supported a little bit by Elisha Kent Cain's brother and a little bit by spiritualist supporters, but exactly what she was doing, we don't know. But we do know what Lee was doing. Lee was getting married again after Calvin had died. In 1857, she married Daniel Underhill, and she became Anne Lee Fox Fish Brown Underhill, which sounds like the weirdest word association game. And she decides to eventually retire in 1858, and she's done very well for herself. And she settles down a very wealthy, very happy and content woman. And that's kind of it with her. Katie spends a little bit of time, lives with Lee for a little bit, spends a little time on her own. She is for a long time the only Fox sister who is continuing to do seances. And she continues to do seances all throughout the 1860s. In 1865, John Fox and Margaret Fox pass away. They die. And Katie continues her seances and continues to operate entirely by herself, I guess, to get through the grief. Maggie is off somewhere. Lee is happily retired. And in 1872, so we're jumping forward quite a bit now. In 1872, she meets a chap called Henry Jenkin. And she marries him. He's an Englishman. They move to England. And she kind of gives up seances. She does them a little bit here and there. But she too kind of settles into married life. And she has a kid. She has a couple of kids, actually. The youngest child is said to also have spiritualist abilities. Now, according to the missing link in Modern Spiritualism, Anne Lee's book, the youngest child as a toddler used to communicate with spirits and write it down, messages on a chalkboard, occasionally in Greek, you know. So Katie is living happily with her husband. Anne is living happily with her husband retired, and Maggie is living unhappily with a bottle, hopefully being looked after. And things kind of carry on like this for a little while. Spiritualism explodes, becomes hugely, hugely popular. That's Daniel Underhill on the left, by the way. That's a later picture of Anne Lee. Spiritualism becomes huge. People all around the world adopt it, and it becomes much bigger than just knocks on the table. Spirits actually appear, ectoplasm flowing from the mouth, ghosts coming out of everywhere, musical instruments flying into the air, spiritualist mediums levitating and floating out of windows. It becomes huge, huge, huge business. Massive, absolutely colossal. Now, unhappy times for Katie next, because although she was married to Henry Jenkin and had 2 kids in England, Henry has a stroke in 1881 and passes away. And Katie herself turns back to alcohol, very much like Maggie had after Elisha Kent Cain died. Katie goes back to America with her 2 children, and continues to drink and do seances and drink and do seances and gets increasingly upset. At which point, in 1888, so again, jumping forward quite a long time because there's a lot of periods of time where not a lot is happening. 1888, Katie has a visit from what would be family services of the time. And they come to take away her children because they've had a report of her drinking getting out of control. Frequently, Katie's at bars, collapsing all over the place. And so the children are taken away from her and she's distraught and she is upset. And she gets in touch with Maggie. And this is where some sort of crazy Mission Impossible stuff goes down, because what happens is Maggie goes, right, well, we can't allow that. We can't allow your children to be taken away from you. Now, can we, Katie? What are we going to do about it? We may be successful and wealthy, but we're still women in the 19th century. What are we going to do? I have an idea. Henry Jenkins had a brother called Edward, living in England. The children are half English, which means if there was somebody who could act as guardian in England, the children could be sent there. But you don't want that. They didn't want the children to be sent to Edward. So Maggie writes a letter to Protective Services pretending to be Edward, saying, I will take the children. She goes over to England, goes to a hotel where Edward is registered as staying, to collect the letter that Child Services had sent back to him to confirm all of this. She pretends to be Edward's widow, because he's overseas at the time. He's nowhere to be seen. And the hotel give her the letter that she then opens and then writes back to the Child Services and says, yes, I've got your letter. I can confirm all of this. Send the children over. And the children get sent over to England to stay with Uncle Edward. And Katie gets off the boat with the children and Maggie's there to greet them. And she kind of goes, here we go, children. Say hello to Uncle Edward. And I love that tale. I love that story. It's all kinds of unethical, but oh my God, wasn't it amazing? And they kind of think they know who was responsible for this. Things had been a little bit tricky with Lee for quite a while. A little uncomfortable with Lee. They weren't happy with the relationship. They felt she was bossy and taking charge and control. And they think that Lee is the one who has reported Katie and her drinking. So they're angry. And for a while, Maggie has been becoming disillusioned with spiritualism, very upset with spiritualism. And she decides she's going to do something. So she gets back on the boat. She heads back to America to make an announcement. And this is where the title of this talk comes from. The death blow to spiritualism is this book. Maggie gets off the boat and she meets up with this chap, Reuben Briggs Davenport, and she says, boy, do I have something to tell you. You know how we created this entire global movement, modern spiritualism. You know how it started with us two in our rooms when we were children, hearing the knock, 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 rat-a-tat-tat. It was all lies. Shock. Katie comes on board and she goes, yep, I agree with my sister Maggie. All complete nonsense. And you know what? Lee was one of the biggest driving forces. She made us carry on this charade. So what was going on? What happened back in 1848 to get to the death blow to spiritualism? It was a joke. According to Maggie and Kate, it was a joke. They were doing it to initially scare their mother. They would knock on the floor and sometimes tie apples to string and bounce that. And when their niece, sorry, the relationship dynamic's weird. When Lizzie was staying, they discovered they could create these knocks and bumps using controlled clicking of their toe joints. The people who thought they were using bones to create the knocks were right. They just had the wrong bone in the wrong part of the body. And so Maggie says, yeah, I will even demonstrate it to you. So she calls a press conference and she goes on stage and she says, yep, we started all this as a scam. And then our sister found out about it and she insisted on us carrying on the scam. It's all Lee. She forced us into this. And she demonstrates the knock, 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 the rat-a-tat-tat. And this is The Death Blow to Spiritualism. Came out the same year as The Missing Link in Modern Spiritualism, which Lee published, which was her autobiography, which is 90% Lee saying how brilliant she is, by the way. And just look at that. That's Lee's book. That's The Death Blow to Spiritualism. And so they do these speaking endeavours, and the skeptical scene embrace them and go, yes, see, we told you, ha! And the spiritualist scene is like, well, no, they must be wrong. And also, even if they are lying, it doesn't change the rest of the mediums. And Maggie and Kate think this will be the end of spiritualism. They think it will be the death blow. And the scientists and skeptics at the time, they also think it will be the death blow. They think it must be. The founders of spiritualism are saying it's nonsense. It must be. It doesn't quite have the impact anyone was expecting. Skeptics kind of go, yeah, we knew it was the case. And believers went, meh. By 1888, the Fox sisters, as famous as they weren't really relevant anymore. Anne Lee had retired 30 years ago. Maggie was in and out of spiritualism. Kate was the only one kind of practicing still. And there were bigger and better mediums at the time. Daniel Douglas Hume could cause instruments to play in darkened rooms whilst tied up and could fly out of windows. Other mediums could conjure through manifestations of ghosts. Florence Cook could bring through the ghost of Katie King, who would appear on stage. Katie King also appeared in Philadelphia as well. That one actually was discovered to be an absolute fraud when they chased the ghost out of the building and found out it was actually the lodger. But that's another story. But there were bigger and better mediums by this time, and no one really cared what the Fox sisters had to say. Kate was the first to retract the confession. She, after 3 months, says, no, I was pressured into it by Maggie. And she goes back to doing seances. And she's welcomed back. And Maggie carries on for another 9 months before she too says, I can't deny this anymore. I was angry and upset. But the spirits, they won't leave me alone. And I have to retract my confession. It was kind of too late. The skeptics had what they wanted. The spiritualist community didn't really care. Maggie and Kate continued to do occasional seances, spend the last few years of their lives being looked after by their loyal supporters, drinking away the rest of the years they had left. Lee passes away at the age of 78 in 1890. Natural causes, carditis, it's to do with the heart. And a couple of years later, Katie, July 2nd, 1892, she passes away from a disease of the kidneys brought about through her drinking and her alcoholism. And Maggie, the following year, she slips into a coma for a couple of weeks, brought on by her drinking, and she too passes away March 8th, 1893. And that is kind of the end of the Fox sisters. Initially, Kate was going to be buried in the Underhill plot with her sister Lee. Eventually, her and Maggie were buried in this plot at Cypress Hill Cemetery. A more recent tombstone has been put up, the Fox Headstone Project. You can find them on Facebook. That's where these images are taken from. Give them a follow. They look after the headstone. They make sure it's in good condition. As you can see, even though the Kane family didn't want to acknowledge her, she is acknowledged historically as Margaretta Fox Kane, Catherine Fox, Jenkin, Fox sisters, the founders of modern spiritualism. Or were they really just children playing a game? That is the question that has persisted for many, many years. I'm just going to kind of round this up now because there's actually a little bit more to talk about the modern world. About 100 years ago, the Fox family house was moved down the road, piece by piece, to a place called Lilydale. Lilydale is essentially a town comprised entirely of mediums and spiritualists and psychics. And the house was moved there about 100 years ago. About 50 years ago, it burnt down. So the Fox Sisters house no longer exists. But the remains of it do. The original house in Hydesville, not when it was moved, the original house, the foundations are still there. And about 15 years ago, a wonderful woman by the name of Tracy had seen that the place was in kind of disrepair. This is kind of how it was. This is it after it was cleaned up a little bit. It was overgrown and forests and bushes and trees everywhere. And she's instrumental in having attention paid to the Fox home, to the Hydesville foundations. And over years, this house is built over it, this little hut, and a sign is placed up, the Hydesville Memorial Park, and this is now in Arcadia, just down the road from Newark. And in 2019, I had an opportunity to visit and go inside, and you can see there's this little doll's house here that is a replica of the house, and it's gorgeous and adorable, and I love it. And it's so gorgeous. You can see as well there's a little wreath on the floor. And here I am standing on the centre. I'm standing on the exact spot where the body of Charles B. Rosner was supposedly buried. But what happened to that? It kind of got forgotten in all the history of everything that was going on, the celebrity of the Fox Sisters. Well, in 1904, some kids got in to what was left of the remains, knocked down a wall and found some bones. Not buried where they said they were, and not human, but still, it's a story that gets told. Probably dog or animal bones. But some people do insist they were human bones. So that's kind of the place now. That's the location now, and you can kind of visit there by appointment. And I got a chance to go there in 2019. And the Fox Sisters and everything that they have done has impacted so many people around the world. Whether you believe they were genuinely mediums, or whether you do believe they were just kids messing around, they had a huge impact for better or worse. A lot of people see mediumship as distasteful. Some people see it as helpful. What the Fox Sisters did, rightly or wrongly, for better or for worse, was they provided an opportunity for largely women at the time to engage in professions outside of the traditional and to be able to make a very good amount of money from it. Like I said, thousands of dollars in modern money per week they were making. So they did a lot, but they also created something that a lot of people see as harmful. A lot of people see spiritualism as cruel, as mocking the dead. Others see it as helpful. For me, it had a huge impact on what I do as my work. I wouldn't be doing mentalism, really, and magic, if it wasn't for my interest in the supernatural. It doesn't matter that I'm a skeptic. I love this story, and I love the tale of the Fox Sisters, and I love everything about this. It's just deeply fascinating. And today is the anniversary. 174 years ago today, it's lunchtime in Hydesville. Maggie and Kate are having their lunch, and this evening, knock, knock, knock. Either it's a ghost, or it's them cleverly controlling the knuckles on their feet. It's one of the two. But it starts a huge movement. Massive. And speaking of making lots of money from doing their spiritualist engagements, you can donate to us, paypal.me/noisyghostent. The kind of description is just down there. Do donate if you can. Help me pay for my Restream account that I had to subscribe to get this going tonight. And that's kind of it. That's the Fox Sisters. That's even that, an hour, I've managed to cram it all in. There's still loads more that went on in their lives. There's a few books I would recommend if you want to know more about them. There is Anne's book, Anne Lee, The Missing Link in Modern Spiritualism, and there's a lot in there. A lot of it, like I say, is kind of bluster. A lot of it is Anne Lee selling herself and reprinting letters of people who say how wonderful she is, but it's really interesting. It is nearly 500 pages. Then we have The Deathblow to Modern Spiritualism, which is a much shorter read. This is Maggie and Kate's interview with Reuben Briggs Davenport, their memoir, and both of these you can find on places like Project Gutenberg and other public domain places, as well as this, which is you can get from the Britain Museum and Library. Most spiritualist place will sell it. I think it is also public domain. Report of the Mysterious Noises. Some of the more general books I've read for this include Talking to the Dead by Barbara Weisberg. Really, really good book. And possibly my favourite, which is a biography of Maggie herself, my favourite Fox sister, The Reluctant Spiritualist. Picked this up when I was in Palmyra, where Mormonism began. Actually, this was sold to me by Tracy, who I later discovered was the person who had access to this space. So that's the Fox sisters. That is spiritualism. And that's something I'm deeply fascinated by. I'm going to take some questions. Hopefully we have got a few. We don't have any questions. Okay. No.
Thanked you, and Danov says hi.
Danov says hi, Danov. Hi there, Danov. So no questions, but hopefully I'll get to do this talk in person at some point soon, hopefully for the Edinburgh 14 Society. And yeah, I think it's important, whether you're a believer or a skeptic, to know the story of how spiritualism began and to decide whether or not what Maggie and Kate did really was the death blow. You can find Spooky History on most social media at Spooky Hist Show. We put out 10-minute videos on spooky, weird, strange stuff regularly. I do magic. It's Ash Pryce. I've got a show coming up during the Fringe called Ghosts, which is kind of a seance. I also do talks and lectures and walking tours and all sorts of stuff, and I'm available for bookings around the world. Maybe. It depends on like pandemic and all that. Thank you anyway. Thank you very much for joining us. I've prattled on quite a lot. I need to go and drink more coffee out of my Fox Sisters mug. Thank you to everyone who listened and joined us today. Take care, and please do have nightmares. Goodbye.